Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We're going to get started. Thank you so much for attending this afternoon's Start Justice webinar featuring Professors Jennifer Schwartz and Jennifer Sherman. Our topic today is Rethinking Rural Recidivism, System Navigation Problems and the Myth of the Revolving Door. We're very excited to have both Professors Jennifers with us. My name is Jia-Chen Yu. I'm a policy attorney at the Decent Criminal Justice Reform Center and the moderator for today's program. The Decent Center is a nonpartisan policy, research, and advocacy center housed at the Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law. We use a stats and stories approach to smart, sane, and sensible criminal legal reform. Our expertise focuses on the Sixth Amendment right and access to counsel, and our major research areas focus on pretrial due process, early stage criminal procedure, STAR justice events like today, which stands for small, tribal, and rural justice systems, and prosecutorial discretion, specifically on screening and charging processes. For those of you who might be new to Decent's STAR Justice series, the events in this series highlight innovations, challenges, as well as opportunities in small, tribal, and rural criminal legal systems. We speak to people, we speak to folks who live and work in STAR communities and offer a networking platform for STAR practitioners, stakeholders, researchers, and policymakers nationwide. We're so happy that you are here today to join in the conversation. Now, I'm about to turn it over, so I will very, very briefly introduce our speakers, not because their accolades are anything on the short side, but because I know you guys want to hear them talk about the topic. Professor Jennifer Schwartz and Jennifer Sherman are both with the Washington State University's Department of Sociology. Professor Schwartz is a criminologist who conducts statistical analysis of community crime patterns and trends, and Professor Sherman is a sociologist who focuses on rural poverty and rural communities, and her research relies on in-depth interviews and participant observations to gain thorough understandings of the individual's experience. So it's great that they're coming together to work on this mixed methods project about the criminal legal system in rural Washington. I'm personally very excited to hear about their findings from both the qualitative and the quantitative side. Throughout the presentation, I want to invite you to drop questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A box. We appreciate you being respectful, clear, and if possible, concise in your comments and questions, so we can address as many of them as possible after the presentation. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the Professor Jennifers and to hear about this exciting topic.
Thank you. I'm going to get screen sharing started here. We'll be ready to go in just a second.
All right. Well, thank you very much to the Decent Center for inviting us here to present our work in progress. This is a piece that's currently under review. We also want to thank the Vera Institute of Justice and Arnold Ventures, as well as the National Institute of Justice for supporting the larger and ongoing research project. And we also appreciate you all coming to hear about our research, Rethinking Rural Recidivism, System Navigation Problems, and the Myth of the Revolving Door. And we really look forward to feedback and questions and engaging discussion after the presentation. So on to our work. So in the summer of 2019, we began work on a multi-methods research project focused on investigating a disturbing trend. Rural jail populations have been growing over the past 2 decades, even while urban and other jail populations declined and prison populations were declining. So by 2019, just prior to the pandemic, rural jail populations were 2.4 times higher than that of urban jails. This means that mass incarceration increasingly is becoming a rural phenomenon. So our project set out to explore these new dynamics of mass incarceration with local, county, and municipal jails as the front door.
So to learn more about the causes and the consequences of this increase in rural jail incarceration, our project focused on 6 rural counties in eastern and central Washington state. And this is a large but often neglected region that's kind of distinct from the urban and liberal west side of Washington in terms of population density, economic capacity, and political orientation. So these are sparsely populated and politically conservative counties, which cover a very vast expanse of land. The largest of our counties is twice the size of Delaware, and they include really varied landscapes, from dramatic mountain ranges to desert scablands to just endless dryland farming. The people living in these rural counties are poorer on average than others in Washington state, and the communities themselves have far fewer economic and structural resources. And while these are all tied together geographically and socially, our 6 rural counties do have pretty distinct economic drivers and demographics, and they represent 3 pretty different clusters. So 2 of the counties are mostly white and heavily dependent on mechanized agriculture. Another 2 have higher than average Latinx populations and are tied to labor-intensive agriculture. And another 2 counties are dependent on forestry and tourism with significant Native American and Latinx populations. And as we spoke with people working in these counties' criminal legal systems, we kept hearing the same story. They described their jails to us as revolving doors that housed the same people repeatedly, mostly due to drug addiction and sometimes mental illness. So Jail Superintendent Paul Lewis, and this, like all the names you'll see today, are pseudonyms. He told us, "I'm sure most everybody here would agree that the influx of drugs and the change in inmates' behavior since had a huge impact on our ability to do our job. It's just a never-ending cycle and a revolving door, and they get lost and keep coming back over and over and over again." Another jail commander, Roger Brooks, estimated for us that many of his residents were jailed every other month or so, and he told us that if he hadn't seen them in a while, it was likely because they were in a neighboring county's jail. So our project used multiple methods to investigate these claims. And as Jen will explain, our research revealed a pretty different story. Re-entry was having an outsized impact on jail populations, but it wasn't necessarily due to drug abuse or untreated mental health issues alone.
So rather, what we discovered was that there was a large proportion of jail stays were not due to new criminal activity, but instead to minor issues like missed court dates, non-adherence to treatment or other conditions set by the courts, failures to pay fines, fees, or other legal financial obligations, and or driving with a suspended license, which could have resulted from a prior unpaid fine. System navigation problems, as we call this constellation of charges, often reflect difficulties navigating both financial and logistical struggles, requirements of a confusing, inaccessible, and complicated bureaucracy that's set in motion upon arrest. So vulnerable people in vulnerable places are particularly susceptible to SNPs, and our work will highlight how features of virality and criminalization of poverty can intersect to make SNP enforcement more likely and perhaps more damaging, contributing to individuals' downward spirals and worsening place-based social and spatial inequalities. Although we won't fully detail here, our work draws on and extends several literatures. So we start from the well-established finding that mass incarceration is driven by legal policies and practices, and we focus on net widening at early stages of the criminal legal process that targets minor transgressions that lead to pretrial jail stays. These net widening policies have elevated the use of misdemeanors and imparted legal financial obligations that help sustain a bloated misdemeanor justice system. We also build on previous work on criminalization of poverty that's focused on economic issues like fines and fees, extending outward to highlight the degree to which poverty is further criminalized through social control practices that target individuals and communities with fewer economic, structural, and social resources, thus contributing to inequality at the individual and at the geographic level. We extend out beyond fines and fees to also consider the importance of non-financial mechanisms or means by which the legal process might contribute to inequality. So in this endeavor, we build upon work that recognize the ways in which complex bureaucracies, opaque processes, and conflicting obligations to multiple entities represent significant hurdles that trap those with fewer resources in a maze, deepening inequalities.
And we find that this combination of fines, hassles, obstacles, and obligations can create all sorts of inescapable challenges to resolving criminal legal entanglements, especially for vulnerable individuals in places with structural lacks. So we're basically criminalizing poverty of both people and place. So recognizing this, our work also delves into how rural disadvantage intersects with current non-financial means of criminalizing poverty, contributing to mass incarceration. So rural places frequently experience significant structural lacks and vulnerabilities, we know. Rural criminal legal systems overall can be understaffed and slow, meaning that visits to rural jails can be long, unpleasant, and personally destabilizing. And digging into the details a little more, rural criminal legal systems often lack support services to quickly process and release people when they're incarcerated, including limited alternatives to jail time and lengthy waits for hearings and trials. Rural systems also often lack lawyers, public defenders, pretrial programs, and diversion services. But beyond the criminal legal system, rural lacks can include all sorts of things like affordable housing, public transportation, mental and physical health services, and reliable internet and communications, among many other issues. So with these issues in mind, we set out to better understand what was driving rural jail incarceration and recidivism through our multi-methods research.
All right, to dig in and introduce some of the research we did, I spearheaded the quantitative data collection. And so we began by signing data use agreements with 5 of the 6 rural jails, which allowed us to obtain raw booking and release records. So we digitized the non-electronic records, and then we cleaned, coded, standardized, and merged all the information across the jails. Even though the jails in our study were pretty small, they were built to house between 40 and 200 people. Over the 5 years that we observed, these 5 facilities processed over 55,000 booking incidents. The majority, 75%, were pretrial. So we analyzed these pretrial booking incidents only. The jail records really had an astounding amount of detail about charges that's not typically included or available in criminal justice data collections. So this allowed us to delve into the main drivers of pretrial jail admissions and discover this outsized role being played by SNPs. We identified the most serious top charge based on description or statute, using the first mention when there were several of equal seriousness for the same individual. We calculated length of stay using date and time stamps for pretrial entry and exit from jail, and we curtailed stays over 1 year to limit the effect of outliers. And finally, to assess the extent and reasons for jail reentry, we used name matching and birth dates to identify people who were booked multiple times into our study jails for additional new incidents, pretrial incidents during the study's 5-year time frame.
I, on the other hand, spearheaded the qualitative portion, which had a number of main parts, one which was 37 in-depth recorded phone interviews with individuals who'd spent time in one or more really of our participating county jails. This sample included about equal numbers of men and women. The average age was about 45. The sample was mostly white, which reflects the demographics of most of these counties as well, with smaller percentages of Native American, Latinx, and Pacific Islanders, and a number of the participants identified as more than one. They had a pretty wide range of criminal legal involvements, with charges that included domestic violence, drugs, DUI, and failure to appear, among lots of others. Their incarceration experience also ranged quite from people who'd been in jail less than a day to having spent large portions of their lives in jail and prison. We also conducted a series of both formal and informal interviews and focus groups with system staff from our 6 participating counties. Our staff participants included sheriffs, jail commanders, lieutenants, corrections officers, and mental health staff. In all, 14 jail staff members participated in the interviews and/or focus groups, and all but one of those participants were men. The larger project also had a couple other parts, including content analysis of sheriff's Facebook pages from our counties and ethnographic observation of online courtrooms during the pandemic lockdowns.
So the combination of methodologies was really important to us for uncovering both the large-scale patterns in rural jail incarceration and also understanding how they were produced and reproduced. So throughout the data collection and analysis, our research team met regularly over 3 years to discuss the emerging results, and the quantitative and qualitative researchers really relied on each other to help frame and make sense of the findings. Regarding today's topic, the concept of SNP emerged through detailed analysis of state legal statutes and textual charge descriptions that were available in this unique data set. Then understanding of the data was benefited by discussions with those in rural legal systems about the meaning and practices that were behind enforcement of these legal statutes we were coding in the data. We were also able to observe criminal case processing in several of the district courts through Zoom or in public proceedings cast on YouTube during the pandemic. Once the patterns had been identified in the quantitative data, the qualitative analysis was able to uncover the mechanisms by which SNP worked to contribute to recidivism and long-term criminal legal entanglements. So digging deeper into this concept and how we defined and measured SNPs, these again are charges that reflect financial or logistical difficulties with case resolution. So SNP charges mostly related to court non-appearances or failure to appear. Warrant arrests, often due to bench warrants for court non-appearances, as well as for other reasons, were next most common, along with driving while on a suspended license. Usually it's DWLS in the 3rd degree. Finally, a smaller share of system navigation problems included failure to comply, such as with court-ordered treatment, and other quote-unquote failure charges related to legal directives to obey, to register, to pay, and so forth. So these charges are all interrelated and reflect the same underlying process, as we'll also see with the qualitative data momentarily. But for example, in the quantitative data, in one county where we could ascertain the original charge for which an individual failed to appear in court, more often than not, the most common preceding charge was DWLS, driving with a license suspended. So you can see how they're all interrelated. The reason why SNP is so important is that it is the first and foremost reason why people enter jail pretrial. SNP charges were 4 times more common compared to the next most prevalent booking charge of assault. And contrary to popular understandings, drug-related charges accounted for fewer jail bookings, about 7% of the total, and DUI another 7%. So the impacts of system navigation problems on jail populations are notable. In this chart, we use length of stay information to show cumulative number of person days over 5 years spent in jail, arrayed by top charge. So overall, again, the greatest single use of pretrial bed space was for individuals arrested and jailed for system navigation problems. Over 1/3 of bed space was dedicated to housing people for SNPs. This is true even though on average, those jailed on drug-related charges tended to be held longer in jail pretrial. So the large number of SNPs combined with the length of time people were spending in pretrial confinement made SNPs a driver of burgeoning jail populations. So turning now to the issue of jail reentry, here I'm showing on the inner circle shows the distribution of people booked into jail who were grouped by the number of times they were booked over 5 years. The outer circle shows the distribution of all jail bookings and allows us to see the impact of recidivism versus single-time jail entrance. So while many people, 64%, were jailed just once and did not return to a participating jail over the 5 years observed, a small share of people re-entered jail repeatedly and accounted for a large proportion of pretrial booking incidents. So for example, 8% of people accounted for 22% over 1/5 of all pretrial bookings. And nearly half, or 43% of daily bookings, were of those with 3 or more jail stays. So next we examined the charges on which those repeat entrants and others were going to jail. So we examined jail reentry patterns for up to 5 pretrial bookings per person to assess whether SNPs, drug charges, or other types of charges were particularly prominent in the jail histories of those who recidivated. So as you can see on the graph on your left, system navigation problems were significant among those entering jail even only once. 38% entered on an SNP charge. But SNP charges were especially prominent in the jail histories of those who were caught up in the system. So for those who returned to jail repeatedly, 5 or more times, the cumulative likelihood of at least one SNP-related stay was near certain, 80%. So 8% of this group re-entered exclusively due to SNP, 5 out of 5 times, in other words. The graph on your right compares drugs as a reason for jail entry and re-entry. So as you can see, SNP was clearly a more significant contributor to jail bookings, especially repeated bookings, than were drug charges.
Yet despite what the booking data shows, our system staff tended to see their inmate populations as really dangerous criminals who were there for doing bad things and who deserved to be locked up for the greater good of their communities. As we mentioned, they described their jails as revolving doors that house the same inmates repeatedly for continued recidivism of the same types of problems, right? Generally, they portrayed this revolving door as catching people for the same crimes over and over. Lieutenant Tim Campbell told us, there's bad people on the street and there's bad people in the hills and there's bad people that need to come to jail. Jail Commander Roger Brooks estimated for us that 97% of his inmates, he thought, were there for drugs, and he described them as frequent flyers. You look in there and go back in their history and they've been in numerous times for the same stuff. So most system staff really agree that the bulk of their populations were these types of offenders for whom incarceration was deserved and recidivism was the result of repeated drug-related crimes. And occasionally, though, some jail staff did seem to understand that rural social structures also contributed to the revolving door. So this is Tim Campbell again, who was quoted on the previous slide, explaining to us how license suspensions, which is one of these SNP-related issues, could effectively trap people in the justice system. He told me, let's say inmate A, he comes to jail the first time for whatever reason, his license gets suspended, and in a small area, the police officers and the local precincts know who this offender is, and they continually ride him while he's trying to get to probation meetings, court hearings, family events, work. And so the fees just continue to add up. And then you put this guy in jail, or it may be more court time, more court. It's just a revolving door. They're so far in the hole, it's just impossible for them to get out. So interestingly, for Lieutenant Campbell, this understanding of SNP as undermining rural residents' abilities to recover from small infractions somehow existed alongside that more common belief that most of the return inmates were bad people. But the system involved individuals that I spoke to told a very different type of story. Their experiences help explain why SNPs tend to lead to these return jail visits. So I'll start by introducing Michelle Turner, whose jail experiences were pretty limited, with charges including a single DUI, as well as failure to appear and failure to pay fines. Related complications included the suspension of her driver's license. She explained to me, I got myself in trouble by drinking and driving one night. I was released, but then because of a failure to appear back in court, that issues a warrant. And then I got picked up at my house for the warrant. Then I spent another, and this kind of perpetuated itself, like back and forth for about 2 or 3 years, just because I didn't have the money to pay it then. I didn't, I was struggling in between trying to get housing and doing everything else. It took Michelle several years to pay off her fines and end this cycle of returning to jail periodically. And in this endeavor, she was continually hindered by struggles related to her rural setting. She told me, I was trying to get into a house or apartment or whatever. Housing in this county is very difficult. There is not a lot of it at all. I didn't have a vehicle. I shouldn't be driving. So I needed something close and on transportation. So we were living at Motel 6. There goes your money right there. Beyond her financial and housing struggles, Michelle felt that her repeated jail stays undermined her relationships with her children and their respect for her. When I asked her how they reacted to her criminal legal entanglements, she replied, oh, they were pissed. They were pissed. My oldest two especially my eldest. He was like, what is your effing problem, Mom? I mean, oh God, yeah, it wasn't good. And he never let me live that down for 3 or 4 years. And although this experience was traumatic for Michelle, she did go on to stabilize her life with substantial help from her new husband. Her now relatively advantaged status as a married, middle-class, and stably employed white woman helped protect her from further impacts of her criminal legal system involvement. But in this, she was a lot luckier than most of the people that I spoke with. For many other folks, the downward spirals created or exacerbated by SNPs continued indefinitely. Aaron Johnson struggled with severe depression and related drinking problems, and he was arrested once for theft of alcohol, leading to a seemingly never-ending cycle of jail incarceration. So after his arrest, he was required to complete an alcohol recovery program, but it really didn't address the larger issue of depression that drove him to drink. And he explained, I just wasn't able to make it through the program. I think it was supposed to last. It was an outpatient treatment program that I think was supposed to last like 3 months, but I didn't make it through that. And just like each time I had to go back, I got a little more jaded by the experience because it didn't seem to be doing anything for me. But it was basically do that or go to jail. And I think each time I ended up in jail. Aaron also received failure to comply charges for other issues, including at one point failing to complete his work crew requirements because, as he explained, I had to walk super far in the middle of winter to get to it, and I had a twisted ankle. So without a car or his, any kind of public transportation to rely on, Aaron racked up yet another failure and another court date, and the cycle just continues. In Aaron's case, these failures to comply led to failures to appear in court, particularly given that his drinking and depression led to struggles to keep track of his court dates. He said, I've had several bench warrants issued because of a failure to appear. 1 or 2 times I did not even know that I had a court date, or it would be more accurate to say I did not remember. So I had a court date, didn't know about it, missed it for obvious reasons, and got arrested and thrown in jail. And then other times, because of my issues with anxiety and depression, I would wake up and I could not make myself even get out of bed to go to court. I've had several bench warrants for that particular reason. And this continued cycle of arrests and jail time finally contributed to Aaron's eventual homelessness, which then further contributed to the cycles. He said, I didn't get court notices when I was homeless, but when I was caught, I was usually ticketed there on the spot, and they would say, okay, just show up at this court date, and more court. Aaron felt that he could have navigated the system better if he'd had more support, particularly from his legal counsel. But as he explained, there are good things and there are bad things about this town. One of the bad things being, as I'm guessing is the case in many rural areas, the legal criminal justice community. I asked, what do you mean by that? And he said, I mean that, for example, public defenders are overworked. They're hard to come by. There's only like 3 judges here. I don't even know if we have that many now. And I don't have a good relationship with them for probably fairly obvious reasons. As these stories illustrate, in the majority of cases in our data, SNP wasn't catching people who committed the same crime over and over, but rather making it really difficult for people to recover from what was often a single arrest on a more serious charge. This was the case for Randy Sanchez as well, who said, I don't really recall how many times I've been in the county jail, maybe 4 or 5 times. And when I went in there, it was for nothing. There was only one time I went in there for something major. And the other times it was in there for, failure to appear or a court warrant, out of town court warrant. And these stories also illustrate that often SNP charges were directly related to rural structures that undermined individuals' abilities to navigate the justice system, including those related to transportation limitations, information delivery systems that relied on stable mailing addresses, lack of judicial resources, and small town surveillance. Clay Nash described the ways in which his situation was exacerbated by rurality, and the scenario he describes is eerily similar to that described by Lieutenant Campbell earlier in the presentation. He told me, so the cops know you. They know you by name. They know your vehicle, and they don't need a reason to pull you over. They are going to. If they see you driving and they know that rig because it's a small town, they are going to pull you over with or without cause. It is illegal for them to do that. It's called profiling, but in a small town, they don't care. They're going to. Once this cycle began, it became self-sustaining for many of our participants. Clay Nash summed up the S&P cycle like this. He said, 90% of people that go to jail that I've met there aren't pieces of shit. They want to do better. They want to have a better life. But when you get in their system deep enough, you can't. You can't get a decent job. If you can't get a decent job, how do you pay to get your license back? If you can't get a license back, you can't get a decent job. It is this downward spiral effect that is really hard to hit the brakes, and it is really hard to stop. Okay, so that's kind of a lot. But to conclude, to a large degree, the rise in rural jail incarceration is being driven by system navigation problems rather than more serious crimes. Collectively, jails dedicated over 1/3 of daily bed space to holding those booked on SNPs. Over 40% of booking activity was consumed by SNPs. And importantly, these charges were super common among those with repeated jail stays. We found that for those caught up in the system, S&P charges often set a downward spiral in motion. The constellation of S&P charges had impacts throughout an individual's lives, undermining employment, housing, income, and relationship stability. Rural, social, and structural conditions often exacerbated these spirals and/or increased the likelihood of getting caught up in S&P charges in the first place. Low income and vulnerable individuals were the most likely to get entangled in these types of charges and face the biggest struggles in ending cycles of S&P related consequences. So these folks were, often on their own with few social ties to people who might understand the intricacies of the systems in which they were ensnared, and their repeated arrests and jail stays served to further undermine their lives and well-being, thus increasing their likelihood of more criminal legal entanglements. These are people that are disadvantaged both individually and geographically, right, due to their own biographies, but also due to the structural, cultural, and financial constraints of the places where they reside. This, we argue, is one of the major contributors to the trend of differential justice by geography. So in order to reduce jail populations and repeat incarceration, we recommend addressing the S&P phenomenon at multiple levels, including the judicial and law enforcement level, but also recognizing that providing vital services can help individuals to better navigate rural justice systems. So at the local level, access to housing, transportation, jobs, and treatment for health, mental health, substance use, and gendered violence are all needed. At the local criminal legal level, we need to improve access to public defense and counsel. We need things like digital court reminders, relicensing programs, aid in navigating these systems, and diversion services. And at the structural level, probably many things are needed, but some of them include better integration of social services with criminal legal services, also decriminalization of some categories of misdemeanors, and finally, broader recognition of the logistical as well as financial means by which poverty is criminalized. And we also need more research to improve our understandings of how and why this type of net widening is occurring. So hopefully some of you will help us with that in the future. But for now, we just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and thanks to everybody who participated in this research, whether as a participant or a researcher.